We live in a world where fame is pursued blindly by seemingly everyone at some point in our lives. I have seen countless stories of people uprooting their lives to chase fame and fortune, and it leading to them being in a far worse position than they were originally in. People quitting their jobs and spending their savings on expensive and unnecessary equipment, thinking they are going to be the next big thing on Twitch. I've seen stories of people doing some crazy new TikTok trend that has ended with lives being cut tragically short. The pursuit of fame for many is a constant void that nobody seemingly has the answers to. This, of course, is nothing new to anyone. For seemingly as far back as anyone can recall, there's always been people willing to do practically anything to be in the spotlight, regardless of what it could mean for them or anyone else. And while this is not blaming any of these dreamers for being naive, it is a warning that there are people out there that will see those dreamers and capitalize on it at their expense. This is no more prevalent than the story of Tomoaki Hamatsu, otherwise known as his nickname Nasubi, who in 1998 participated in a game show with the hopes of boosting his career into the mainstream. But unfortunately, the journey that he was about to go on would change his life forever. Susanoo Denpa Shonen was a Japanese game show that ran from 1998 to 2002, and in that short time featured some truly outrageous yet familiar challenges that was sure to draw people into watching. Some of these challenges included two men stranded on a secluded island and trying to escape, a man hitchhiking from South Africa to Norway, and another being the focus of today's story. Nasubi was a comedian trying to break into the entertainment business and figured that appearing on a popular game show would do nothing but help in that goal. Yet when Nasubi entered the contest and won, he had no idea of what was going to follow. Once winning, he was blindfolded and put into the back of a car and driven to an unknown location. When the blindfold was removed, he was in an empty apartment, naked and facing a camera. Awkwardly laughing and looking at the crew as they made their way to the door, he asked, "What is this?" To which he was asked a simple question: "Can a man live on winning sweepstakes alone?" The door was then shut, and Nasubi found himself alone. Nervous, yet excited at the prospect of fortune and fame, Nasubi's journey was eventually going to lead him to a living nightmare. The apartment that Nasubi was now calling home was anything but that. There was no bed, no food, no TV, no clothes, not even a chair to sit on. While it did have some things like a shower and a gas burner, Nasubi was lacking other things that made those essentials almost insulting. What I mean by that is that he had a shower, but no soap or any towels. He had a gas burner, but no food. Having those things there almost seemed to be there solely to mock him. The reason Nasubi was in this room, the game show that he was on, had the following premise. Nasubi had to win everything that would go into that apartment. He would be released and win the game after accumulating 1 million yen, or $10,000, worth of material goods. And when I say everything, I mean everything. From food to clothing, a bed to drinks, literally everything would have to be won through sweepstakes entries. And to add even more of a challenge, those entries were completely random. Nasubi's life became that of a person who would dedicate all of their time to entering sweepstakes for 16 hours a day, entering nearly 1,500 letters a week. And he did this for the next 15 months. Every week, his segment would be shown to audiences, and at the start, Nasubi was upbeat and excited. He would make jokes and still behaved completely normal. The first episode that was released is still debated to this day on if it was staged or not, but regardless, it was either a very cruel joke or horrible luck. What I am referring to is that Nasubi answered the door to collect his prizes and was excited to see that he had won ramen, but it was delivered to the wrong address and taken away. By this time, Nasubi had not eaten in nearly 2 weeks. Nasubi's luck did improve with him winning a bag of rice, but with nothing for him to cook it in, he was instead eating the rice raw. Over the next few months, Nasubi would continue entering the sweepstakes, winning things like a bicycle, a belt, shoes, women's lingerie, and dog food, all seemingly useless items for him. Nasubi would also go on to win a television, but with no antenna or a cable box to use. All the TV could do was produce white static. It was things like this, where something could fill a person with so much hope, only for it to be reduced to essentially useless, that really started to affect Nasubi. Looking at the videos now, it is hard to even imagine the mental strain that all of this was putting on him. To be isolated for that long, doing a repetitive task of filling out sweepstake entries with no form of relaxation or entertainment to distract him. I couldn't imagine doing this for a full day. And by now, Nasubi had been doing this for close to 8 months. As you can tell from his physical appearance, he got even skinnier than he was when he started the show. His hair had grown longer, and his personality was fading by the day. You can even see glimpses of Nasubi seemingly break from reality. After all, with no form of contact, he was probably acting this way as a means to seemingly keep his sanity intact. Him being so animated with everything he did and over the top with his reactions may strike the viewer as weird. But to Nasubi, it was a means of interacting with something, anything. And for me at least, looking at it from that perspective changes the entire scene. There was some good news that came to Nasubi. Months after he had won the TV, he also won a PlayStation 1 with a game. Overwhelmed by the notion that he can finally do something different, Nasubi played his newly won PlayStation for 3 straight days. He stopped after the third because he realized that it was consuming him, and he wasn't focusing on his goal of entering more sweepstakes to ultimately win the game. Around 11 months in, Nasubi was nearing the finale of his sweepstakes. He only needed a few more prizes and he would surpass the 1 million yen goal. And in all that time, he is still, as you can tell, naked. He never really won any real article of clothing other than what I had mentioned prior, and the reason I am bringing this back up is because near the end he eventually won some clothes, but due to him spending more than 300 days without clothes, when he actually wore new ones, he hated how they felt on his skin, and they actually made him uncomfortable, so he went back to being naked, preferring how it made him feel. I probably don't need to point out how much mental damage this show had done to him by this point, but this act by Nasubi spoke volumes to me. How at the start he wanted some article of clothing since he was in front of a camera, and by the end he directly went against that notion of wearing any type of clothing. On day 335, nearly an entire year since he had started this game show, Nasubi won a bag of rice that was finally enough to push him over the 1 million yen requirement. And as a way to celebrate Nasubi's victory, the producers decided to sneak into his room in the middle of the night while he was sleeping and set off confetti poppers right in front of Nasubi's face. When it finally dawned on Nasubi that he had won, he was overwhelmed and excited to finally get to leave that small apartment. He was given the next day to relax and enjoy time at an amusement park, as well as have as much food as he wanted. Thinking that the game was all over, Nasubi was unaware that he had only completed the first part of the game. The problem for the producers was that Nasubi was a massive hit. Towards the end of his run, the show was getting close to 17 million viewers every Sunday night, a record that is still hard to imagine over 20 years later. The producers wanted to keep milking the show for all it was worth and knew that their cash cow, Nasubi, had to be involved. So, instead of letting him just be done with the whole thing, they informed him instead that he would have to win his way back home, using the same method he did for the 1 million yen originally. Nasubi was put back into another apartment, asked to strip, and told to win the amount he needed for his plane ticket. And while this may seem hard to believe that he would willingly go along with this, what worries me is that due to him being isolated for nearly a year, Nasubi was not in the right state of mind, and the producers of the show were absolutely taking advantage of this. Fortunately, Nasubi was a pro by this point and won the prize money needed for the ticket rather quickly. Not being happy with this happening so soon, the producers then changed it to him needing to win a business class ticket, and then, after that, a first class ticket. And again, Nasubi won both shortly after. Knowing that they couldn't keep this up and wanting to capitalize as much as they could on the ending of Nasubi's time on the show, the producers again took Nasubi to another apartment, and figuring that this was going to be yet another challenge, Nasubi began to strip and started filling out sweepstakes. When all of a sudden the four walls of the apartment fell to the ground, revealing a live studio audience looking at Nasubi, who was center stage. Showered in spotlights, and hundreds of people shouting congrats at him, followed by a roaring applause. Does this, honestly, look like a happy man? Like someone who just won a game show and is going to win a big cash prize? The shock and confusion on Nasubi's face is heartbreaking. You can tell that he is scared, and he had no idea that this was going on, let alone for him to be completely nude in front of hundreds of people without even getting his permission says loads about the producers of this show. But going even deeper is them not even once considering what this could have done to Nasubi. What would they have done if he reacted violently to any of this? Would they have simply turned it around on him and made it his fault? I am inclined to say yes, since the producers of this show have never issued any type of apology on behalf of the show. And I know that people are going to justify it and say that the crew were probably giving him food and water when the cameras were not rolling. But to that I say, you are not looking at the bigger picture here. The show very much took advantage of a naive young man and continued doing so well past the point of it being any type of acceptable. Nasubi was a cash cow to them, not a human with feelings. And none of this was just a trend of the 90s either. Shows like Survivor, Fear Factor, Cops, Cheaters, and more have all used the human experience as the plot line and showed people in their most vulnerable state and took advantage of that through means of monetary gain. The monster in this show was simply greed. And it took from a man not only a year of his life, but also caused his physical appearance to change to someone who was underweight, unhealthy, and unable to properly care for himself.
お邪魔します。
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 すみません。
お邪魔します。お邪魔します。
お邪魔しますって。
どうも。なすびくん。
家崩れちゃったんですけど。
家、なすびくんのこれ部屋崩れちゃったの。
そしたらなんか人いっぱいいるんですけど。なんで笑ってるんですか。
ここどこかわかる？
今どこわかる？
っていうかこれが何なんですか？
なすびくんついに検証生活ゴールしました。おめでとう。
おめでとう。
この会場に来てくださったお客さん、なすびくんのゴールを祝うために集まってくれたと言っても過言ではないお客様です。
あ、そういうことになってるんですか？
なすびくんゴールしたのよ。
そうだったんですか？
はい、終わりおめでとう。
ありがとうございます。
1000人の大観衆がゴールを救った。
そしてなすびくんが検証生活に突入して約1年3ヶ月、その間に
そんなナスビの姿は日本中の人々の心を捉えて離さなかった。 そしてそれは舞台を韓国に移してからも決して変わることはなかったのだ。そう、この1年3ヶ月の間、日本は空前のナスビフィーバーに沸き返ったのだった。前人未到の挑戦にまず各マスコミが飛びついた。さまざまな雑誌、新聞にナスビの文字が躍る。中にはナスビのイラストを表紙に上げる雑誌まで登場。さらにナスビフィーバーは国内だけにとどまらなかった。イギリス国営放送 BBC がナスビの継承生活を全世界に向け報道。
Fortunately, Nasubi does have a happy ending. He used his fame from the show to find a comfortable living in acting and has since become a humanitarian. Two notable instances were when he attempted to climb Mount Everest to raise money for the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and later in 2020, he urged people to practice staying indoors and spoke of his own dealings with self-isolation and how it can be done safely. Nasubi was able to accomplish something that not many people would have been able to do, and for that, I applaud him. It's more than I can say for the producers of this show, who saw a human being's mental state as nothing more than dollar signs. Today's video is sponsored by Manscaped. Now, I have covered a lot of disturbing things on this channel, but one thing that is equally disturbing that seems to always get thrown under the rug is a man's balls and the ungodly mess that it can become. However, a solution to this never-ending problem comes in the form of Manscaped, the global leader for men's grooming and hygiene products. Manscaped's products are precision-engineered tools for your family jewels, and the lineup of different products that they have are sure to have you both looking and smelling your best. The Performance Package 4.0 is a great example of that, with their Lawnmower 4.0 trimmer featuring a cutting-edge ceramic blade that was designed to prevent nicks and cuts. The Lawnmower 4.0 is rechargeable and waterproof, and the cherry on top is the LED spotlight on the end to give you the best precision possible. It also comes with a travel lock system. Just push the button 3 times and you won't have to worry about your trimmer turning on mid-flight. The package also includes the Weed Whacker, a waterproof nose and ear hair trimmer, Crop Preserver, which not only smells amazing, but is also great for all-day sweat protection from the places that seem to sweat the most. The Crop Reviver, that smells equally amazing and is also infused with aloe, can be a nice and quick way to freshen up any time of the day. Manscaped even threw in the Shears 2.0, a convenient travel case that includes scissors, nail clippers, tweezers, and a nail file for on-the-go body maintenance, as well as the Shed travel bag that holds all of my Manscaped products. I myself have actually been using Manscaped products for years, so it's easy for me to swear by them. They even include a convenient bag for you to store your puke. If you are ready to start taking care of your private grooming needs, then head on over to manscaped.com and get 20% off plus free international shipping with code CADAVER. Again, that is a full 20% off your order with code CADAVER. Thanks again to Manscaped for sponsoring today's video. It has long been said that true horror comes from human beings instead of monsters. From various videos I have made on this channel to things that we all read about in our day-to-day lives, it is somewhat scary how desensitized many of us have become to acts of violence, where shock and disbelief has been replaced by saddened acceptance. And as I thought I had gotten to a point where I wouldn't hear or read about anything that would shock me, I came across this story. A crime that was so gruesome, it would go on to be known as the Nigerian Forest of Horrors. The forest that was so ominously named was the Soka Forest, located in Ibadan, Oyo State, Nigeria. And it would become the site of a crime that would strike the country to its core and leave in its wake sadness, distrust, and vengeance. The story begins in March of 2014, when the frequency of disappearances had been increasing over the past year. While law enforcement did what they could to locate these missing people, rarely did it conclude with anyone ever being found. Frustrated by the lack of any real progress being made, locals began to search without the aid of police, and one of the biggest parties that was out searching was a motorcycle taxi company. Several of their own riders had vanished themselves, and similarities started being put together when those searching discovered that several riders all had their final pickup request from the outskirts of town, near the Soka Forest. Adding to that were the whispers of a cult having a presence in the area, along with several suspicious-looking people who had been seen lurking around Ibadan. It wasn't a far stretch for kidnapping cultists to be a possible reason for the disappearances either, as Nigeria has had a long history with ritual killings or sacrifices. As the search for the missing began to increase, it was the motorcycle taxi company that discovered the first major clue. While out searching, 2 riders were near the Soka Forest and faintly heard screams even over the sounds of their motorcycles. As they quickly pulled over to stop, the screams continued, and as the twisted trees of the forest looked back at the riders, the screams and cries coming from within didn't lessen at all. The 2 riders knew that inside the forest was something evil. Police were immediately notified, and on March 22, 2014, police made their way into the forest, and when the screams were then heard by them, many started running deeper into the woods. As police got closer to the source of the screams, even more cries and pleads could be heard. It was then that the police officers came across an opening and discovered an old and dilapidated building, and almost immediately were all hit with a stench so revolting that it caused some to stop running and vomit, while others covered their mouth and started to back up due to the overwhelming smell of rot. Some of the officers ignored the smell and continued making their way to the building, where now it was clear was the source of the screams and cries. Upon entering the building, police stared in shock at the bodies chained to the walls, some moving and some staying completely still in unnatural positions. Police acted quickly to free those who had been bound. 2 men immediately collapsed to the ground crying and thanking God. Others bolted for the exit, and it was reported that one man stood up and then immediately dropped to the floor, dead. By this point, police had radioed in for more assistance and that ambulances would be needed immediately. As the scene was eventually enveloped by more law enforcement, locals got wind of what was going on, and many showed up in droves to a now closed-off forest entrance. Screaming, yelling, and demanding people were all told to keep their distance as the scene needed to be properly examined and those inside needed to be rescued. Meanwhile, inside of the forest, dozens of police officers were searching all around the area for survivors. While some were found, most of the discoveries were those of the dead. Skeletons littered much of the area, and as one officer later quoted, "It was like something out of a nightmare of the very worst kind. Everywhere you looked, all you would see is death. I am not a skeptical person, but even I could feel an energy there. That place was evil, and whatever resided there was not human. There is no possibility." And from what I read about what was discovered in the forest, I would have to agree with him. Police would later find small pockets of areas completely filled with bones, clothes, jewelry, passports, children's toys, photographs, and other personal effects. When the final person was freed from their chains, it made 15 survivors in total who were all quickly transported to a hospital for immediate care. From there, police would learn from those survivors exactly what happened and what they had experienced. Some told stories of being taken by a group of people who kept their faces covered. Others told of how they were only allowed to eat once a week. and were never allowed to be unchained, not even to use the bathroom. And they were forced to go where they sat. And the even more horrific thing was that a few of these survivors were in such a state of shock that it took them weeks to even begin to speak. Many had no recollection as to what their names were or where they lived. Police had an incredibly tough time getting any of their identities since all of the survivors were so emaciated that comparing pictures to their current appearance to that of missing persons was practically impossible, since they looked completely different. It was at this point that the news coverage had exploded all across the country, which led to even more families traveling out to the hospital in Ibadan in hopes of finding missing loved ones. As the days passed and the survivors began feeling a sense of safety, police began to further question them about what had happened in the forest. One survivor told a story of many people being used for sacrifice and others being kept there solely to bear children, and that those children would go on to be used in those rituals. Another survivor said that they were forced to become cannibals by their abductors. And if you believe it or not, there are even worse things than that, but I know that I cannot mention them on YouTube. By this point, the government had gotten involved and the state governor had visited the forest, and he was actually so disgusted by what he saw, he reacted emotionally rather than logically, and he wanted the building to be destroyed and the bodies to be buried in a mass grave. Protests from law enforcement, however, slowed the process down due to them wanting to forensically examine the crime scene, but the governor was adamant about wanting that scene to be destroyed. Simultaneously, while that was going on, due to a lack of progress being made on whoever was behind these abductions, locals began going on a vigilante-style search for anyone who could know information about what happened in the forest. There was one report of a group viciously beating a woman who was thought to have knowledge on the cult, and another man actually being killed by locals due to him sulking around the area near the building the survivors were found in. I have, however, read conflicting reports on this attack, that this man was found to have 4 human tongues on his possession, where others said that he had ears, and others said that he just had foreign currency. The situation was rapidly getting out of control, as very few answers were being met, and due to this tension and frustration, the governor forced the destruction of the building and burial of the bodies before much could actually even be examined, completely destroying forensic evidence in the process. A move that was so costly, it still haunts most all involved to this day. And the reason for that is that in the almost decade since this horrible crime was discovered, there have been no concrete answers onto why this happened, and nobody has been tied to the horrible crime. Just imagine that. Almost a decade of easily one of the most evil things people could do, and nobody has been linked to the crime itself. The frustration that many officers felt caused them to leave the force entirely. And while many left, there were others who did what they could to do some kind of mending to this tragedy. One of those mending pieces was when a man by the name of Wally was reunited with his family after he had been positively identified by his sister when she went to Ibadan on the long shot that he could have been one of the missing people. And as heartwarming as it is to see a family reunited with someone that they assumed dead, it takes a dark turn and creates so many more questions when it is discovered of how long Wally had actually been missing. It wasn't for a few weeks, or even a few years. Wally Ola had been missing for 14 years. When asked about his capture and time with the cult, Wally was unfortunately vague on the details as he couldn't really remember anything. I can't begin to imagine how he not only survived that long, but how he hadn't actually lost his mind. And while Wally had a happy ending with finding his family again, it raised even more concerns as to how long this particular cult had been around, and if they had more of what are essentially prison camps around the area, or if it is scattered around the entire country itself. And with that comes the frustration that there will likely not be any answers due to many in the government quickly getting the scene to be destroyed and having the bodies buried. All that seemingly accomplished was leaving people with sadness, bitterness, and anger. And that alone is strong enough to create a whole different kind of evil. On December 18, 1994, 27-year-old Alison Botha was heading home in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, after dropping her friend off from a party earlier that night. As she made her way home, passing the same street lights, road signs, and houses, everything pointed to this night being like many other, and that soon young Alison would be sound asleep in bed. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But an event was about to take place that would not only shock those who later read of the story, but for Alison, she was about to experience a living nightmare. As Alison pulled into her driveway and put the car in park, she was caught off guard when her car door flung open and a man forced her into the passenger seat before quickly taking off. In less than 30 seconds, Alison went from being in the safety of her driveway to being abducted by a stranger. "I don't want to hurt you," the man said. "I just need to use your car for an hour." He identified his name as Clinton and drove himself and Alison to another part of the city. With thoughts racing through her head, Alison stayed silent and didn't beg the man to let her out. Yet the fear that Alison must have been feeling in that moment surely turned to full-on dread when Clinton arrived to his destination and a second man entered the car. The pair then took Alison with them, and instead of taking her back home and just stealing her car, instead they headed into the outskirts of town. Once they arrived at a secluded area, the pair forced Alison out of the car and made her walk down an embankment. And once there, the man going by Clinton informed her that he and the other man were going to rape her. They asked if she would fight them, and out of fear, Alison told them no, hoping that they would just let her go after. And after they were finished, they knew that they couldn't simply let her leave. So the pair began to inflict some of the most heinous injuries a person can do to another human being. They began with trying to choke her, but after several attempts and realizing that she was still alive, they began to kick and beat her. Again, Alison still drew breath, and this seemingly enraged the two men, because instead of just calling it off and leaving, one of the men pulled out a knife. And after it was all said and done, Alison had been stabbed 30 times, with several of those wounds coming from the pair attempting to mutilate her reproductive organs. In the aftermath, they noticed that Alison was twitching still, and not happy with this, they then began cutting her throat. The men did this 16 times. After they had finished this, one of the men asked, "Do you think she's dead?" The other man responded, "Of course she is. Nobody can survive that." The men then left Alison there, taking her car and fleeing the scene. As the sound of the car's engine became distant, silence fell on the night, and in that silence, Alison took a breath. She was, to absolute shock, still alive. Alison struggled with her consciousness and knew that she was going to die. She knew that she at least had to leave a clue, so she wrote the men's names in the dirt as well as a message saying, "I love you, Mom." As Alison then laid there, waiting for her eyes to close for the final time, nothing was happening. She was bleeding and in a tremendous amount of pain, yes, but she was still alive and breathing. She could hear cars passing above her on the road and knew that if she was going to get out of this, then she needed to get help. Alison got herself up, but quickly noticed that something was very wrong, and as she sat up, her head began to fall backwards. On reflex, Alison grabbed the top of her head and realized to her horror that she had to physically hold her head in place. You see, the injuries to her neck were so severe that she had practically been decapitated. And as she got to one knee, she discovered another problem. She felt something very wet on her stomach, thinking at first that it was just her blood. To her horror, it was in fact her intestines falling out of her stomach. Alison managed to get on her feet with one hand holding her head and the other holding her stomach, both being essential at keeping her alive at that moment. Alison made her way to the road and then collapsed in the center of the road on the white lines, knowing that she could very likely just be hit by a car, but she knew that it was the best place for her to be if anyone was going to find her. As Alison laid there, drifting in and out of consciousness, she wondered if anyone would find her, and then if anyone would even help her. Her question was soon answered when the glow of headlights appeared and stopped near her. Footsteps were heard running to her, and a male voice yelling to her to get a response. When she began to move, the man quickly took action and called emergency services while staying with Alison. Thankfully, the man who found her, Tian Eilard, was a veterinary student and managed to get her exposed thyroid back into her neck. Emergency services arrived, and once she arrived at the hospital, many of the staff were shocked to learn that she was in fact alive. One of the doctors on duty that night said that her injuries were the worst he had ever seen in 16 years. And as unbelievable as Alison's injuries were, she managed to survive and make a full recovery. Not only that, but she remembered everything from that night and was able to give a detailed description of the men who attacked her. Thanks to this, the two men were arrested and identified as Thens Kruger and Franz de Toy. The two had a history of violence, particularly against women, and the preceding trial captured the attention of South Africa as the true horror behind the savage attack was put on full display of both Kruger and Franz. Both men were found guilty on several charges and sentenced to life in prison. As Alison's physical wounds healed, the emotional and mental damage that was done took much longer, and Alison herself knew that she could either spend her life pretending that it didn't happen and suffer in silence, or she could face that fear head on. And as it may come to no shock by this point, since Alison Botha is a badass, she chose the latter option and became a motivational speaker. She talked about her attack and encouraged other survivors to come forward as well. She went on to win several awards for her courage and strength following the attack that changed her life. And to give this story the happy ending that it deserves, Alison Botha was able to have 2 children following the attack, even after Kruger and Franz tried to take that from her years earlier. If anything can be taken from Alison's story, it would be best to quote the woman directly. Life can sometimes make us feel like the victim. Problems and hardships and traumas are dished out to all of us, and sometimes they can be divided unfairly. Remind yourself that you do not have to take responsibility for what others do. Life is not a collection of what happens to you, but of how you've responded to what has happened to you.